Russia, 1947. Part 1. A Frozen Faith. Post-war Russia was a land of silent suffering, where whispers of faith were carried cautiously in the cold air. It was a time when hope seemed to freeze alongside the endless snow that blanketed the Siberian wilderness. In the far reaches of this icy expanse, where the wind howled with an almost vengeful force, there stood a forgotten village, hidden from the prying eyes of the Soviet regime. The village was small, a cluster of wooden homes barely visible beneath the thick layers of snow. The roofs sagged under the weight, and the paths that once connected the homes were now buried beneath icy drifts. The only light that flickered in the village came from a small, weathered church at the farthest edge of the settlement. Inside, the walls were worn, the wooden beams creaking with the strain of the cold. A fire burned low in the hearth, struggling to keep the bitter chill at bay. Anatoly, a young man no older than 27, stood before a congregation of perhaps 30 souls. His dark hair, matted from the cold, was hidden beneath a woolen cap. His breath came in visible puffs, freezing the air around him as he spoke. His sharp blue eyes, usually bright with conviction, were clouded with concern. The war had taken much from this village, fathers, brothers, sons. And now, it seemed, the brutal winter would claim what little remained. The church was dimly lit by a few flickering candles, their flames trembling as if even they feared the storm that raged outside. The congregation, men, women, and children, huddled together on the rough wooden benches, wrapped in layers of woolen scarves and coats. They clung not only to the warmth their clothing provided, but to the fragile thread of faith that still bound them together. It was this faith that had brought them here, despite the bitter cold, despite the ever-present danger of persecution. Anatoly had always been a beacon of hope in this village, but tonight, even he felt the weight of despair. His heart, usually so full of fire for the Lord, now ached with the gnawing uncertainty of their survival. The last of their food had been eaten days ago, and the storm showed no signs of relenting. The wind outside howled like a wounded animal, its icy breath seeping through the cracks in the wooden walls. It was as if the storm itself had come to snuff out the last flickers of hope from the village. "We are not forsaken," Anatoly spoke, his voice low but steady. He stood at the front of the small church, his hands resting on the worn altar, which was little more than a table draped with a fraying cloth. "God is with us, even now, even in this storm." His words hung in the air, a fragile warmth that fought against the cold reality pressing in from all sides. The faces that looked back at him were gaunt, hollowed by hunger and fear. Among them was Sophia, an elderly woman whose faith had never wavered, not even in the darkest days of the war. Her hands, gnarled with age, clutched a small wooden cross that she kept hidden beneath her shawl. Her eyes, though dimmed with years, still shone with a quiet conviction. She believed, with every fiber of her being, that God would deliver them. But even she could not ignore the pangs of hunger that gnawed at her frail body. Beside her sat Mikhail, a man who had lost everything: his family, his home, his faith. The war had left him broken, and though he attended these secret gatherings, he did so more out of habit than belief. His once strong frame had withered under the weight of grief, and his eyes, once filled with life, now held only a dull acceptance of their fate. He had seen too much suffering, too much death, to believe in miracles. Anatoly saw their faces, saw the exhaustion etched into every line and crease. He felt their silent pleas, though none dared to speak them aloud. How could he, their pastor, offer them hope when his own faith felt as fragile as the ice that clung to the windows? He had prayed, night after night, for deliverance, but the heavens had remained silent. The storm outside seemed to mock their prayers, each gust of wind a reminder of the relentless cold that sought to consume them. Yet, Anatoly could not allow himself to give in to despair. He was their leader, their shepherd, and it was his duty to guide them, even through the valley of the shadow of death. With a deep breath, he raised his hands, calling the congregation to prayer. The room filled with the soft murmurs of voices lifting their hearts to God, each person whispering their own desperate pleas for mercy. The sound of prayer mingled with the howling wind outside, creating a haunting melody that seemed to echo through the empty streets of the village. Anatoly knelt before the altar, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His prayer, though silent, was fierce. "Lord," he thought, "we are your children, and we are lost. We have nothing left but our faith. Please hear us. We are in desperate need of your mercy." The minutes dragged on, each one heavier than the last. The cold seemed to deepen, wrapping itself around their bodies like a cruel embrace. Anatoly could feel the exhaustion settling into his bones. He had not eaten in days, and the constant weight of leadership pressed down on him like an unbearable burden. But he refused to let it show. He could not afford to let them see his weakness. As the prayers continued, Anatoly's mind drifted to the dangers they faced. If the Soviet authorities discovered their gatherings, it would mean imprisonment or worse. The regime did not tolerate any form of religious worship, and their small community was already under suspicion. Yet, here they were defying the very laws that sought to suppress them. It was an act of rebellion, but it was also an act of faith. And that faith was all they had left. The fire in the hearth crackled weakly, its warmth barely reaching the congregation. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind battering the walls of the church as if trying to break through. Anatoly's hands trembled slightly as he rose to his feet, his knees stiff from the cold. He looked out at his congregation, at the faces that had become so familiar over the years. They were more than just followers to him. They were family. He knew that their faith was being tested, perhaps more than it ever had been before. And yet, even in the face of such overwhelming odds, they remained. They prayed. They believed. Anatoly felt a surge of pride mixed with sorrow. He wished he could do more for them. He wished he could provide them with food, with warmth, with safety. But all he could offer them was prayer. And so they prayed. The night stretched on, the cold growing more oppressive with each passing hour. Anatoly led them through him after him, his voice steady but growing hoarse. His eyes flickered to the windows, where the snow continued to fall in thick, unrelenting sheets. He could barely make out the shapes of the houses across the street, the snow piling higher and higher. As the last hymn faded into silence, Anatoly lowered his head, a single tear slipping down his cheek. He quickly wiped it away, not wanting the others to see. He couldn't afford to show weakness, not now, not when they needed him to be strong. "We will survive this," he said, his voice barely a whisper, but filled with a quiet resolve. "God is with us." And though the storm outside showed no signs of stopping, there was a flicker of warmth in Anatoly's chest. It was faint, like the last embers of a dying fire, but it was there. He clung to that warmth, to that faith, even as the cold threatened to snuff it out. The night would be long, but Anatoly knew that they would continue to pray. They had no other choice. It was all they had left. Part 2. A desperate prayer. The storm had been relentless for over a week, its icy tendrils creeping into every corner of the village, pressing down on the people with a crushing force. Each day was a battle against the cold and hunger, and each night brought the same gnawing uncertainty. Would they survive to see the morning? The food stores had been depleted days ago. All that remained were scraps, bits of dried bread, and potatoes so frozen they had become impossible to cook. The villagers had long stopped complaining. Instead, they moved in silence, conserving what little energy they had left, as if speaking aloud might break the fragile resolve that held them together. Anatoly trudged through the thick snow that covered the narrow paths of the village. His body, though wrapped in his heaviest coat, was no match for the unforgiving Siberian cold. The snowdrifts were waist-high in some places, making every step a laborious task. His breath came in short, visible bursts, each exhalation freezing almost instantly in the air. His face was numb, his fingers stiff despite the gloves he wore. The cold had become a part of him, a constant companion in this never-ending battle for survival. He had spent the morning visiting the homes of the villagers, offering what little comfort he could. His presence, though meager in its physical offerings, was a balm for their spirits. In each home, he knelt with the families, their hands trembling as they clasped his, whispering prayers for warmth, for food, for deliverance. The children, once full of life and laughter, now sat silent and wide-eyed, their cheeks hollowed by hunger. Mothers cradled them, brushing frostbitten hair from their brows, murmuring promises that they didn't know if they could keep. As Anatoly approached one of the final homes, a small wooden cottage barely visible beneath the snow, he paused to catch his breath. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his chest. He could feel the burden of their hopes and fears resting on his shoulders. These were his people, his flock, and though he had always believed in his calling as a shepherd, he had never imagined it would be so heavy, so filled with despair. The wind howled around him, carrying with it a chorus of whispers that seemed to mock his every step. "Where is your God now, Anatoly?" It seemed to say. "Where is your faith?" He shook his head, trying to banish the creeping doubt that threatened to take root in his heart. This storm, this trial, it was a test. It had to be. God was watching. He would answer. He had to. Anatoly pushed open the door to the small cottage, and a gust of wind followed him inside. The room was dimly lit by a single candle flickering on a small wooden table. Huddled around the meager flame were Dmitri and Elena, a young couple who had recently lost their newborn child to the cold. They looked up as Anatoly entered, their eyes hollow with grief and exhaustion. "Pastor," Dmitri greeted him, his voice rough from days of silence. He rose slowly to his feet, his movements sluggish and mechanical, as though his body had forgotten how to move without effort. Elena remained seated, her face buried in her hands, her thin shoulders trembling with silent sobs. Anatoly's heart broke at the sight of them. He crossed the room in a few quick steps and knelt beside Elena, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "I am so sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind outside. He had no words that could heal the pain they felt. No prayer could bring back what they had lost. But he could be here in this moment with them. Sometimes that was all he could offer. Dmitri sank back into his chair, his hands resting limply in his lap. His eyes, once bright with the hope of a new family, were now dulled by the weight of their sorrow. "We prayed," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "We prayed so hard for God to save her. But he didn't." There was no accusation in his tone, only a quiet resignation. "Why didn't he save her, Pastor?" Anatoly swallowed hard, his throat tight with the weight of the question. He had no answers, only the same faith he had clung to his entire life. "God's ways are not always clear to us, Dmitri," he said gently. "But he is with us, even now, in our suffering. He hears our prayers, and he knows our pain." Elena lifted her head, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the faint glow of the candle. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice raw from days of weeping. "Why does he allow us to suffer like this? What have we done to deserve this?" Anatoly felt the sting of her words, not because they were harsh, but because they echoed the very questions that had been swirling in his own heart. "We haven't done anything to deserve this," he said after a long pause. "But suffering, it's part of this broken world. We live in a time of great darkness, but God's light still shines. We have to believe that even when we cannot see it." Elena let out a small, shuddering breath, and for a moment, there was a fragile silence in the room, broken only by the soft crackle of the candle's flame. Anatoly sat with them for a while longer, offering silent prayers for peace and comfort, though the words felt thin in the face of their overwhelming grief. When he finally rose to leave, Dmitri walked him to the door, his hand resting on Anatoly's shoulder in a gesture of gratitude. "Thank you, Pastor," he said softly, "for coming, for staying with us." Anatoly nodded, though inside he felt like a failure. He had brought them no food, no warmth, no hope, only words. And in times like these, words felt so terribly inadequate. As he stepped back out into the snow, the wind struck him with renewed ferocity, and he pulled his coat tighter around his body. The path back to the church was long, and the cold bit at his exposed skin with merciless intensity. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the very ground beneath him had turned to ice. The sky above was a dull gray, the sun hidden behind a thick veil of clouds. It was hard to tell if it was day or night anymore. The storm had swallowed everything. When Anatoly finally reached the small church, he found Sophia waiting for him by the door. Her face was pale, her eyes full of quiet concern. "Pastor," she said softly, "the people are growing more desperate. We need more than just prayers." Her words, though gentle, struck Anatoly like a blow. He nodded, unable to meet her gaze. He knew she was right. The villagers were on the brink, and their faith, once a beacon of strength, was now flickering like the weak flames of the church's candles. They needed more than just words. They needed a miracle. That evening, as the storm howled outside, Anatoly knelt before the altar once more. The weight of his failure pressed down on him, and for the first time, he felt the cracks in his own faith. "Lord," he whispered, his voice trembling, "I don't know what to do. I have led them here, but I have nothing left to give. We are cold, we are hungry, and we are afraid. Please show us your mercy." The wind outside seemed to respond to his prayer, rattling the windows of the small church as if in answer. But the heavens remained silent. Anatoly bowed his head, tears burning in his eyes. He had never felt so small, so powerless. Yet, even in his desperation, he clung to the only thing that had ever sustained him, his faith. It was all he had left, and so he prayed. The hours stretched on, and Anatoly remained there, kneeling before the altar, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The cold seeped into his bones, but he did not rise. He could not until he felt that his prayers had been heard. But as the night wore on, the silence remained, and Anatoly's heart sank deeper into the abyss of doubt. Where was God? Why had he not answered? Why had he left them to suffer in this frozen wasteland? Outside, the storm raged on, unrelenting. Part 3. A Miracle in the Snow. The night had been long and unforgiving, with the storm outside showing no mercy. By the time dawn broke, or at least what passed for dawn under the blanket of thick gray clouds, Anatoly was numb. His knees ached from kneeling in prayer, and his hands were cold and stiff, his fingers curling in against the chill that had crept into the very marrow of his bones. Yet, despite his exhaustion, he did not leave his post by the altar. His faith, though shaken, was the only thing holding him upright. The small church was eerily silent, save for the occasional crackle from the fire that had all but died in the hearth. The wind still howled outside, slamming against the walls like a vengeful beast, but within, there was only stillness. The villagers had long since retreated to their homes, seeking warmth in the small comforts they could find, leaving Anatoly alone in his vigil. The weight of their unspoken expectations hung heavily in the air, a pressure that Anatoly could feel tightening around his chest. He had prayed through the night, pleading with God to send them a sign, a miracle, anything to show that their suffering had not been in vain. But as the hours passed and the cold deepened, Anatoly felt the creeping fingers of despair winding their way into his heart. Had God abandoned them? Were they truly alone in this frozen wasteland? A sharp knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. The sound was jarring in the oppressive silence, and for a moment, Anatoly thought he had imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. He rose slowly to his feet, his legs trembling from both cold and fatigue, and made his way to the door. As he opened it, the wind rushed in with a fierce gust, and Anatoly had to brace himself against the sudden force. Outside, the storm raged on, the snow falling in thick sheets that obscured everything beyond a few feet. But through the blinding whiteness, Anatoly saw something, a shape moving in the distance, slowly but steadily making its way toward the church. At first, he thought it was one of the villagers, perhaps seeking shelter from the storm. But as the figure drew closer, Anatoly realized with a jolt that it was no person at all. It was a fish, small, silvery fish, glistening in the faint light of the early morning, were falling from the sky. Anatoly blinked, his breath catching in his throat as he watched in disbelief. The fish tumbled down from the heavens, their scales shimmering like fragments of stars as they landed softly in the snow. They came slowly at first, one or two falling here and there, but soon they began to fall in greater numbers, until the ground was covered in a blanket of glistening fish, their bodies motionless yet fresh. Anatoly stood frozen in the doorway, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. For a moment, he thought that perhaps his exhaustion had finally driven him mad, that this was some cruel hallucination conjured by his desperate mind. But then he heard voices, faint at first but growing louder as they neared. The villagers, drawn by the strange sight, began to emerge from their homes, their faces pale with disbelief. Mikhail was the first to approach Anatoly, his eyes wide with astonishment. "Pastor," he whispered, his voice trembling with awe. "Is this real?" Anatoly could not find his voice. He could only nod, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched the fish continue to fall. The villagers gathered around, their faces a mixture of wonder and confusion as they knelt in the snow, picking up the fish with trembling hands. Sophia, her frail body wrapped tightly in her worn shawl, clutched one of the fish to her chest, tears streaming down her weathered face. "It's a miracle," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "God has heard our prayers." For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft patter of fish landing in the snow and the distant wail of the wind. The villagers stood in stunned silence, their breaths visible in the cold air, their eyes fixed on the miraculous sight before them. It was as if time itself had stopped, the storm's fury momentarily forgotten as they marveled at the impossible. Anatoly, still standing in the doorway of the church, felt a warmth spread through his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the cold outside. His heart, which had been so heavy with doubt and despair, now swelled with a joy so profound it brought tears to his eyes. He had prayed for a sign, for God's mercy, and now, before his very eyes, that mercy had been delivered. As the fish continued to fall, Anatoly stepped forward, his boots sinking into the snow as he knelt beside Mikhail and Sophia. He reached out, his gloved hand closing around one of the silvery bodies. It was cold to the touch, yet fresh, so impossibly fresh in this frozen wilderness. "This is his answer," Anatoly said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "God has not forgotten us." The villagers, many of whom had struggled to keep their faith in the face of such overwhelming hardship, now knelt beside their pastor, their hands clasped in prayer. The snow-covered ground became a holy place, where the miraculous and the impossible had collided in a way that none of them could explain. Children, who had been weak and listless just hours before, now ran through the snow, laughing and gathering the fish in their small arms. The sight of their joy brought fresh tears to Anatoly's eyes. He had not heard laughter in what felt like an eternity, and now, here in the middle of a snowstorm, it rang out like the most beautiful music. Mikhail, who had once been so skeptical, looked up at Anatoly, his dark eyes shining with something that had been missing for so long. Hope. "How is this possible?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Anatoly smiled, his heart full of gratitude and wonder. "With God, all things are possible." The villagers continued to gather the fish, their hunger now replaced by a sense of awe and reverence. There was more than enough to feed the entire village, enough to last them through the storm and beyond. It was as if the heavens themselves had opened and poured out their blessings upon this forgotten corner of the world. Anatoly stood, his breath misting in the air as he looked up at the sky. The snow still fell, but now it seemed softer, gentler. The storm had not yet passed, but in this moment, it no longer felt like a threat. It was a reminder of faith, of hope, of the miracles that could happen even in the darkest of times. He turned back to his congregation, his heart overflowing with joy. "Let us give thanks," he said, his voice strong and steady. "For God has provided for us in our time of need." The villagers knelt together in the snow, their hands clasped, their heads bowed as they offered their prayers of gratitude. Anatoly's voice joined theirs, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The cold no longer seemed so oppressive, the wind no longer so fierce. In this moment, they were not just surviving, they were living, and they were living because of the grace of God. As the last of the fish fell from the sky, the villagers gathered around Anatoly, their faces glowing with a renewed sense of purpose. The despair that had once hung over the village like a shroud had been lifted, replaced by something far more powerful, faith. And in that faith, they found strength. The storm may have raged on, but in their hearts, there was peace. Part 4. Faith renewed. The evening descended slowly upon the village, casting a pale blue hue over the snow-covered landscape. The storm had finally begun to ease, though the cold still bit at the edges of everything it touched. In the village square, a large fire crackled and popped, its warmth spreading out in waves that drew the villagers close. It was a rare comfort in the midst of what had been a seemingly endless winter, and the sight of the flames licking at the air brought with it a sense of renewal, a spark of hope. The villagers, their stomachs full for the first time in what felt like months, gathered around the fire, their faces illuminated by the soft, flickering light. The miracle that had befallen them that morning had transformed the atmosphere in the village entirely. Where once there had been only silence, broken by the howl of the wind, now there was conversation, laughter, and the gentle murmur of prayers offered in gratitude. It was as if the fire had not only warmed their bodies, but had reignited their souls. Anatoly stood near the edge of the circle, watching his congregation with a mixture of joy and awe. The change in them was palpable. Where before he had seen hollow eyes and gaunt faces, he now saw life, true life, returning to them. Children played in the snow, their cheeks flushed with warmth and excitement. Mothers huddled close, whispering to one another in voices filled with hope. Fathers, who had once worn the heavy burden of failure, now smiled as they watched their families. Sophia, ever faithful, sat beside the fire, her hands resting on her knees as she gazed into the flames. Her face, lined with age and hardship, was softened by the firelight, and there was a peace about her that Anatoly had not seen in a long time. She had been the first to call it a miracle, and she had been right. Her faith, unwavering even in the face of death, had been rewarded. Anatoly made his way over to her, his boots crunching softly in the snow. "Sophia," he said gently, as he lowered himself to sit beside her. "How are you feeling?" She turned to him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I am overwhelmed, Pastor," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "For so long we prayed, and now, to see this, to witness his mercy in such a way, She trailed off, shaking her head as though words failed her. Anatoly smiled, understanding the depth of what she was feeling. "God works in ways we cannot always understand," he said, his voice soft. "But when he moves, there is no denying his power." Sophia nodded, her gaze returning to the fire. "I never lost faith," she said after a moment. "Even when it seemed like we had nothing left, I knew he would come. And he did. He heard us." Anatoly felt a warmth spread through him, one that had nothing to do with the fire before them. "You were a light for us, Sophia," he said. "Your faith kept us going when the rest of us began to falter." She smiled at that, a small, humble smile. "I'm just a woman, Pastor. It is he who is the true light." Across the fire, Anatoly noticed Mikhail standing alone, staring into the flames with a pensive look on his face. His dark eyes were reflective, as if the flickering firelight mirrored something deep within him. Anatoly excused himself from Sophia's side and made his way to Mikhail, sensing the weight of something unsaid. "Mikhail," Anatoly greeted him quietly, standing next to him by the fire. "How are you?" Mikhail did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the flames, his brow furrowed as though lost in thought. After a moment, he spoke, his voice low and filled with a heaviness that Anatoly recognized all too well. "I didn't believe," Mikhail said, almost to himself. "I came to the gatherings because it's what we did, but I never really believed. Anatoly waited, sensing there was more Mikhail needed to say. He didn't push, allowing the man to come to his own conclusion. Mikhail finally turned to Anatoly, his eyes shining with something that had been missing for so long. Hope, but also disbelief. But today, Pastor, today I saw with my own eyes. That was not of this world. He paused, shaking his head as if trying to grasp the enormity of what had happened. It was real, a miracle. Anatoly placed a hand on Mikhail's shoulder, feeling the tremble in the man's frame. Yes, he said gently. It was real. God heard our prayers, and he answered. Mikhail let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. I've never seen anything like it. I've never felt anything like it. He looked away for a moment, his expression softening as he spoke. I lost my family in the war. I lost my home, my hope, my faith. I thought if there was a God, he had forgotten me, forgotten all of us. His voice faltered, and he took a deep breath before continuing. But now I see. I was wrong. He never forgot us. Anatoly's heart swelled with compassion for the man. He knew all too well the weight of loss that Mikhail carried. God never abandons us, Anatoly said quietly. Even in our darkest moments, when it feels like we are alone, he is there, watching, waiting for us to turn to him. Mikhail nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek. I feel different, he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. Like something inside me has shifted. Like I've been given a second chance. Anatoly smiled, a gentle, understanding smile. That's because you have, he said. We all have. This miracle was not just about filling our stomachs, Mikhail. It was about renewing our spirits, reminding us that there is always hope, even when we can't see it. Mikhail wiped the tear from his cheek, a soft chuckle escaping his lips. It's funny, he said, shaking his head. I've been so angry for so long, and now I just feel peace. That's what faith does, Anatoly said. It gives us peace, even when the world around us is falling apart. The fire crackled softly between them, and for a moment, they stood in companionable silence, watching the flames dance against the darkening sky. The storm had passed, but its memory still lingered, a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. And yet, here they stood, alive, fed, and filled with a sense of wonder that none of them could fully explain. As the evening wore on, the villagers gathered closer around the fire, sharing stories of the day's events, their voices filled with awe and gratitude. Children played in the snow, their laughter ringing out across the village like a sweet, joyful melody. It was a sound Anatoly had not heard in what felt like a lifetime, and it warmed him to the core. The fish that had fallen from the sky were now being cooked over the fire, their savory scent filling the air. It was a simple meal, but to the villagers, it was a feast, a gift from God himself. As they ate, they offered prayers of thanks, their voices rising in unison, a chorus of gratitude that echoed into the night. Anatoly watched them, his heart full. The miracle had not only fed their bodies, it had restored something far more precious: their faith, their hope, their sense of belonging. They were a community again, bound together not by fear or survival, but by something far greater, by the belief that they were not alone, that they were seen, heard, and loved by a God who had not forgotten them. As the fire burned low and the stars began to peek through the thinning clouds, Anatoly stood and addressed the gathering. Tonight, we have witnessed the power of God's love, he said, his voice strong and steady. He has provided for us in our time of need, and for that we give him thanks. But let us remember that this miracle is not just about the food that fell from the sky. It is about the faith that has been restored in our hearts. It is about the hope that has been reignited in our souls. The villagers nodded in agreement, their faces solemn but filled with a quiet joy. We have been given a gift, Anatoly continued. Not just the gift of life, but the gift of faith. Let us carry that with us, not just tonight, but in the days and years to come. Let us remember that even in our darkest hours, God is with us. Always. The villagers bowed their heads in prayer, and Anatoly joined them, his heart full of gratitude for the miracle that had saved them. not just from the cold and hunger, but from the despair that had threatened to consume them. As the night deepened, the fire burned down to glowing embers, and one by one, the villagers made their way back to their homes, their spirits lifted, their faith renewed. Anatoly lingered by the fire for a moment longer, watching as the last of the flames flickered and died. The storm had passed, and with it, the darkness that had hung over the village. In its place, there was light, faint but growing stronger with each passing moment. He turned his gaze to the sky, where the stars now shone brightly against the backdrop of the night. A smile tugged at the corners of his lips as he whispered a silent prayer of thanks. God had heard them, and they would never forget. Part 5. A light in the darkness. The days that followed the miracle were marked by a quiet transformation within the village. It was as if the storm had swept away more than just the snow and ice. It had taken with it the despair that had clung so heavily to the hearts of the people. What remained was something much more precious, an unshakable faith, not just in the physical provision that had rained down upon them, but in the presence of a God who had shown himself in their time of greatest need. Anatoly stood before the altar in the small village church, his hands resting on the worn wooden surface as he closed his eyes in prayer. The early morning light filtered through the frosted windows, casting soft, golden rays across the room. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, filling the space with a warmth that had been absent for so long. The church, once a place of cold and quiet desperation, was now alive with a sense of hope and renewal. The villagers had come together to repair the old building, patching up the cracks in the walls and fixing the broken pews. It had become more than just a place of refuge. It was now a symbol of their shared faith, a place where they had witnessed the impossible and found their strength in God. As the morning sun rose higher in the sky, the villagers began to arrive, one by one, for the Sunday service. They entered the church with smiles on their faces, their steps lighter than they had been in months. Children, once gaunt and pale, now ran ahead of their parents, their cheeks flushed with the glow of health. Mothers and fathers, who had once feared for the lives of their families, now walked with renewed purpose, their hearts lifted by the knowledge that they had been saved. Sophia was among the first to arrive, as always. She moved slowly, her aged body still feeling the effects of the long winter, but her spirit was strong, unbowed. She greeted Anatoly with a nod and a warm smile as she made her way to the front of the church, settling into her usual seat near the altar. Her hands, still gnarled and weathered by time, held her small wooden cross, a symbol of the faith that had carried her through so much. Mikhail arrived shortly after, his expression one of quiet contemplation. He had changed since that day in the snow. There was a softness about him now, a lightness that had not been there before. He no longer walked with the burden of disbelief weighing him down. Instead, he carried with him the certainty that he had witnessed a miracle, and with that certainty came a sense of peace he had never known. As the church filled with the villagers, Anatoly took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This was more than just a service. It was a celebration, a testimony to the power of faith and the grace of God. These people, who had been on the brink of death, now stood before him, alive and filled with hope. When the time came for the service to begin, Anatoly stepped forward, his heart swelling with gratitude as he looked out at his congregation. The faces that gazed back at him were no longer hollow and gaunt. They were radiant, filled with the light of a renewed faith that had been tested and proven in the most extraordinary way. Brothers and sisters, Anatoly began, his voice strong and clear. We are gathered here today, not just to worship, but to give thanks. We have seen the hand of God move in our midst. We have felt his presence, and we have been reminded that, even in our darkest hour, he is with us. The villagers nodded in agreement, their eyes fixed on Anatoly as he spoke. The air in the church was thick with emotion, the memory of the miracle still fresh in their minds. When the storm was at its fiercest, Anatoly continued, when the cold threatened to take us, when hunger gnawed at our bellies, we prayed. We prayed because we had nothing else. We prayed because we believed, even when it seemed impossible. And God answered us. He sent us food from the heavens. He provided for us in a way that defied all logic, all understanding. But that is what God does. He moves in ways that we cannot always comprehend, but He always moves. He always hears us. A murmur of agreement rippled through the congregation. Anatoly could see tears in the eyes of some of the villagers, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of gratitude, of joy. Today, Anatoly said, his voice growing softer, we stand here not just as survivors of a harsh winter. We stand here as witnesses to a miracle. And with that miracle comes a responsibility to carry this faith with us, not just when times are hard, but always. A responsibility to remember that we are never alone, that God is with us, no matter what. He paused, letting his words sink in. The church was silent, the only sound the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Outside, the wind had calmed, and the world seemed to be holding its breath. Let us not forget, Anatoly said finally, that faith is not just about what we see or what we feel. It is about trusting in the unseen, believing in the impossible. And we have been given the greatest gift of all, the knowledge that our God is a God of miracles. With that, Anatoly bowed his head, leading the congregation in a prayer of thanks. The villagers, their hearts full, joined him, their voices rising together in a harmonious chorus that echoed through the small church and out into the stillness of the morning. As the service came to a close, the villagers lingered, not wanting to leave the warmth and fellowship that had enveloped them. They shared stories of their experiences during the storm, of the fear they had felt, and the awe that had followed when the fish began to fall from the sky. There was laughter, and there were tears, but above all, there was a sense of unity that had been missing for so long. Anatoly watched them, his heart filled with pride and love for these people. They had endured so much, and yet here they were, stronger than ever. The miracle had not just fed their bodies, it had nourished their souls. It had reminded them of who they were, God's children, beloved and cared for, even in the most trying of circumstances. As the villagers began to trickle out of the church, Anatoly remained behind, standing alone before the altar. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his role as their pastor, their guide. It was a weight he had once feared would crush him, but now he wore it with a quiet confidence. He knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, with faith as their anchor. The church was quiet now, the fire reduced to glowing embers. Anatoly closed his eyes, offering one final prayer of thanks. Lord, he whispered, thank you for showing us your mercy. Thank you for reminding us that we are never alone. May we carry this faith with us, always. As he opened his eyes, he felt a sense of peace wash over him, a peace that came not from the absence of struggle, but from the presence of something greater, something eternal. He stepped outside, the crisp morning air filling his lungs as he looked out over the village. The snow, once so oppressive, now sparkled in the sunlight, a blanket of purity that covered the land like a gift from God himself. The villagers were scattered across the square, their voices carrying on the wind as they spoke of the days to come. There was talk of rebuilding, of preparing for the spring, of new hope. Anatoly smiled as he watched them, knowing that the true miracle was not just in the fish that had fallen from the sky, but in the faith that had taken root in their hearts. They were no longer the broken, weary people they had once been. They were a people renewed, a people reborn through the grace of God. And as Anatoly turned to walk back into the church, he knew that this was only the beginning. The light of their faith would continue to shine, even in the darkest of winters. God had provided, and they would never forget. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.